All right, so we're diving into the story of Latin jazz, especially kind of focusing on the Cuban side of things. And wow, these sources, they really bring up some interesting points about the challenges and maybe even some biases, when we try to tell that story.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like right away, the source jumps right into the political climate
Hmm.
surrounding Cuban artists,
Hmm.
particularly in the U.S. It almost feels like a warning, right? You can't separate the art from the politics, at least when it comes to Cuban musicians.
Yeah, for sure. And there's this quote about the politically correct ideas that an author is supposed to have when writing about Latin jazz. In the US, it really makes you think, how much does that actually influence which stories get told and how they're told?
For sure. And it brings up some questions about power dynamics too, right?
Yeah.
The source talks about this official version of Latin jazz history that's been promoted by the Cuban exile community.
Hmm.
And so it's interesting to think about what that tells us about who gets to control the narrative, who gets to decide what story gets told, what makes up this narrative, how it's been spread, and what it means that this single perspective has dominated the conversation for so long.
That's a great point. And then the source goes on to point out how artists who stayed in Cuba haven't really gotten that much attention. It's like they've been pushed aside because they didn't fit into that dominant narrative.
Yeah, exactly. The source even says
Mm.
that a lot of the people promoting this official version haven't even done firsthand research in Cuba. It's kind of concerning. That something gets repeated and repeated until it becomes truth. It creates a kind of self-perpetuating cycle where one version of the story takes hold, and then it becomes difficult to challenge.
Yeah, and so it's not about taking sides politically, is it? It's about realizing that there might be multiple perspectives that we're missing out on. What does that mean for these artists who are caught in the middle of all of this?
It creates a really complex situation for Cuban musicians.
Mm-hmm.
The source describes it as a tragic situation, and I think that's fair. Not only are their voices potentially being silenced in the U.S. because they don't fit this official version, but their situation within Cuba can be difficult too. I think to understand why, it helps understand the historical context.
Yeah, and the source has this really powerful example. They talk about Gonzalo Rubalcaba. Now, for those who don't know, he's a very well-respected Cuban pianist, and he was denied the right to perform by the Cuban exile community in Miami. So it just highlights the challenges that Cuban musicians face trying to navigate these incredibly complicated political landscapes where their nationality and political affiliations almost become inseparable from their identity as artists.
Right. We're not just talking about music here either. This goes way beyond the world of art, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, what we're seeing are echoes of other forms of prejudice
Yeah.
and marginalization.
Yeah, you're right. The source mentions this anecdote about Ray Barretto, who was a very prominent Latin jazz musician. And he was introducing another musician, Tata Guinness. And even in that introduction, which seemed positive, there's this underlying judgment about Guinness, about him living in a communist country.
Yeah, it's almost like different forms of prejudice echoing each other. From race to politics, there always seems to be a reason to marginalize someone's art. It reminds me of something that happened maybe like 60 years before that. The source talks about Jimmy Dorsey, who was a very well-known American band leader, and he told his Cuban bandmate Mario Bauza, "It's a shame such a good musician is black." This brings up a big question, though. How can we enjoy art forms like Latin jazz while still understanding these complicated political and social contexts?
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act. You don't want to ignore the history. But at the same time, you want to celebrate the music, celebrate the artists and their talents.
Right. Because the music itself, it can be a form of resistance, can't it?
Right.
A way for these artists to express themselves and their experiences. Even when facing adversity, we really need to try to understand all the little things, the struggles, the victories, all the things that shaped the music we hear.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about the people telling these stories too, right? The writers, journalists, historians. I mean, they have to be as objective as possible to try to present a complete and accurate picture.
Yeah, and they have to be willing to challenge the accepted narratives, to seek out those voices that have been silenced and give them a platform.
And we as listeners, we have to remember to be critical of the information we're taking in, to question what we think we know, and try to see things from different points of view.
Absolutely. Especially with something as rich and diverse as Latin jazz.
For sure. It's about appreciating the music, and at the same time understanding the history and the politics that have shaped it.
Right, and remembering that the story is still being written, isn't it?
Ah.
Latin jazz is a living thing. It keeps evolving and changing, reflecting all those experiences of the people creating it.
It really is. So as we dig deeper into this world, let's try to keep these complexities in mind. Let's listen with open ears and an open mind.
Yeah, and let's be aware of the power dynamics. Who's being heard and who's being ignored.
Exactly, because when we try to understand the story of Latin jazz, we're really trying to understand this complex and fascinating part of history and culture.
It's a journey worth taking.
It really is. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the artists who decided to stay in Cuba.
Oh, you mean the musicians who chose to stay, even with all the potential challenges?
Exactly. I think it's really important to get their perspectives. What made them stay? How did they handle the cultural and political scene within Cuba?
Their stories are so important. And they often get lost, don't they? Lost in the bigger story of Latin jazz.
They do. And it's important to remember that there's no single Cuban experience. There are many different experiences and realities within Cuba itself.
Right, and if we understand those different experiences, we get a much richer, more nuanced understanding of Latin jazz as a whole.
For sure. So as we keep exploring, let's not limit ourselves to just one narrative.
Yeah, let's find those different voices, the untold stories that can help us really understand and appreciate this vibrant and ever-changing art form.
And let's not forget that music can go beyond borders and ideologies.
That's right, connecting us on a deeper level,
Yeah.
reminding us of that shared humanity. That brings us together, even when we're different.
That's a great point. Now, before we get to our final thoughts, I think it's important to touch on something else that's often part of the story of Latin jazz.
Are you thinking about race?
Exactly. We mentioned it a little with the Jimmy Dorsey story, but I think we should explore it a bit more. How has race, and especially racism against Black people, impacted the development and reception of Latin jazz?
That's so important. The source doesn't really go into it much, but the way race and politics are tied together in Latin jazz is a topic we could spend a whole deep dive talking about.
Yeah, it reminds us that these issues are all connected, and we can't understand one without thinking about the others.
Exactly. We have to see the bigger picture
Mhm.
and recognize the systems that have shaped the experiences of marginalized communities within Latin jazz.
And we have to acknowledge the huge contributions of Black Latinx musicians who have been so important in creating and developing Latin jazz.
Their stories are often overlooked. And that just keeps adding to this distorted and incomplete picture we have.
It does. So as we continue this journey, let's keep trying to unpack these issues and amplify those voices that have been silenced for so long.
Yes, it's through these conversations, these times when we examine things critically, that we can truly appreciate the richness and depth of Latin jazz.
And now it's time for our final thoughts. What are some key takeaways that you hope our listeners will think about after this deep dive?
I hope our listener walks away really understanding just how layered and complex this whole story of Latin jazz is.
It's definitely not a simple story, no.
Not at all. You've got politics, race, cultural identity. It's a story that's still being written.
I hope it's encouraged them to look for different perspectives too, dig a little deeper, challenge some assumptions about Latin jazz.
Exactly. The more we learn, the more we realize how much more there is to learn.
That's so true. And I hope they want to go explore Latin jazz more,
Yeah.
like really engage with it.
Go to shows, find new artists, or even just listen with a more critical ear, right?
For sure. There's just so much there. It's up to us to embrace all that richness and complexity.
Yeah, and to make sure everyone's voices are heard, that their stories are told.
Yeah. Well said. Now, before we go, I want to leave our listener with a final thought. If the history of Latin jazz has been so tied to politics, what does that mean for the music being made today?
That's a great question. Makes you think about how artists today
Hmm.
are dealing with that legacy, right? Are they embracing it or challenging it?
And how are all the global events and the changing culture shaping Latin jazz in the 21st century?
It's so dynamic, always evolving. Safe to say the story's not over yet.
It really isn't. This has been such a fascinating deep dive. What's really stuck with you?
I think it's a reminder that even something like music can be affected by power. And that makes you realize how important it is to look for different perspectives, to get the whole picture.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Latin jazz. Until next time, it's